College football nerds here talking top 10. There was a ton of information that we got from this last weekend. Lots of shakeup with Georgia losing, LSU winning, Wisconsin going ham on somebody, and Penn State staying undefeated. So we're going to talk about it. Let us know in the comments what your top 10 looks like. Let us know why. At some point, Josh, we got to have either somebody on to discuss their top 10 or at least highlight one of these from the comments. So maybe not this week, but we'll try. So those have been great discussions. So keep giving us your top 10s in the comments. All right, Josh, for me, kicking this off pretty easy. Still Ohio State. LSU had a lot of movement in the AP poll this week, but for me, they're not taking over that top spot. Ohio State has shown to me that they're really more of a complete team. There's some holes on the LSU side with defensively. Alabama still has some questions on their defense, although the pass rush did come around a little bit. All right, Josh, so Ohio State's my number one, and I'm going to kick it over to you, and I think Ohio State's still your number one. I hope it is for continuity's sake, but let me know what you think about this. Ohio State's big wins, perceptually, are, Nebraska on the road. Big win, killed them 48-7. Killed Michigan State last week. Cincinnati 42-0. But these teams are also getting killed by other teams. Minnesota, I don't know. I think Nebraska was depleted. Minnesota, Wisconsin, Cincinnati struggling with Houston. So is that possibly leaving a question mark in your mind of just how good Ohio State is, or is it, dude, they're number one and there's no question?
It has to leave something of a question mark, to be honest with yourself, right? I have Ohio State number one. I still think they're the best team right now. I think they're the best all-around team. I can't say definitively they're the best all-around team. When you look at the rest of them, if you look at Alabama, you look at LSU, you look at Oklahoma, yeah, they're winning big games, but they're also giving up a lot of points. None of those teams have the balance on offense and defense. Clemson had a great game for once and put it all together, but they have not shown out week to week to be good, even against bad teams. Ohio State has been dominant in every game, and as we talk about a lot, just being dominant even against average teams, like truly drilling them week to week, shows you're good in a way that Ohio State had not done in previous years. And I think we've been rightly critical for them, the same way that we'll be probably differingly critical with regard to Georgia. But I am concerned. The 34-10 game against Michigan State, toot my own horn, I had that 34-13. I mean, that was completely within my realm of expectation. I would not have guessed Wisconsin would have been 38-0. And so my expectation for Ohio State was that they were so good that they would take a pretty good Michigan State team and beat them. And what I saw from Wisconsin was that wasn't a pretty good Michigan State team. I hate to take away from Wisconsin there. That was a bad Michigan State team. And all the flaws that we talked about in our preview, where I said I didn't think their defense was up to prior years by any standard, and that we did think the offense was terrible. The defense is worse than we realized, I think. Nebraska, their offense is a lot worse than we thought might be to at least test Ohio State. I still think Ohio State's really good. They're still dominating at the front. They're still dominating with the run game. But it is a spread offense. We've seen this way too many times at Ohio State, be it Alabama, be it, whoever. They can get in a game against a big team and suddenly turn in a clunker. And so now I'm not as sure as I was a few weeks ago on how that Wisconsin game is going to turn out. But I still think they're the best all-around team, and they have to stay number one because nobody else is that complete.
All right, I'm going to give you my number two, my number three. Alabama at number two. A lot of people are going to say, well, their defense still sucks. They're giving up a lot of points. They gave up 28 to A&M. I will say, and this is not to defend Alabama, we've been high on Mond up and down his whole career. A lot of that is based on how he's played against Alabama. He has always played out of his mind against Alabama. He was making plays against Alabama in this game that he wasn't making easy plays against Clemson and Auburn until late in the game. Against Alabama, he's taking hits, blindside hits, dropping the ball in between three defenders. And they let him run. Finally, they let him run. The big takeaway for me in this game was we're still going to have concerns about Alabama's defense all year. Even if we can make excuses for Kellen Mond or whatever, they still gave up 28 points. But what I saw in this game that gives me hope if I'm an Alabama fan is the pass rush showed up against a good offense. Terrell Lewis showed up, which they've needed for a couple of years now. So that to me tells me that they can have enough disruption, kind of like 2010 Auburn, where their offense is going to score 40 points. All they need to do is stop you on a couple of drives, and then they got you beat. That's kind of what I see with Alabama. That's why they're at number 2. Otherwise, I would have had LSU jumping them, who I have at number 3. LSU's not at number 1, even though they have these 2 really good wins. I think these are really good wins, LSU, Florida and Texas. They're at number 3 for me because of their defense. Their defense did not look amazing against what we think is a decent but not great Florida offense, but also that pass rush. And we went into this in-depth in our review of that game, so I won't belabor that point at all. But basically the pass rush is why I don't have them at number 1 or number 2. That's my 2 and 3. Give me your 2 and 3.
So my 2 and 3, number 2 is Alabama. Echo all the points you made. I mean, you can look at the final score, 47-28. That game was 47-20 at one point. Again, the CBS slot didn't have a lot up against it, so we got to see a good chunk of that one. To your point, Alabama dominated this even more than it looks to a certain degree. I mean, Najee Harris is 5.7 yards per carry. Tagovailoa, I had time to pull this up while you were talking, had 8.6 yards per attempt. I think it's interesting that Mon was 6.3 yards per attempt, 5.6 yards per carry, and the back was only 2.7. So that Alabama is being very dominant. They're scoring so many points that the other teams can't keep up. A&M made all the clutch plays they needed to do to stay in it. It was a lot like the LSU-Florida game in that Florida really wasn't moving the ball that well, nor was A&M, but they couldn't get them off the field. But that's more than enough for have Alabama number 2, given the offense that they have. And then for my 3, I actually have Oklahoma. So that's the team you haven't touched on yet. Don't worry, I've got LSU number 4. Oklahoma, with their offense, I saw them take a big step back in the first half. That was a 10-10 tie. We saw signs of scaling, which, when I say that term, I mean we saw this with Alabama with Jalen Hurts. We see it with the zone read game a lot with a running quarterback, where things are easy when teams are overcompensating with safeties, overcompensating for the run. Texas was able to do enough to stop that, and they couldn't quite counter. Now there were turnovers and other things that happened in that game. Fumbling is not an uncommon thing for Jalen. He's kind of done that his whole career. But there's a little bit there to make me think Oklahoma is very good, but probably right at number 3. I thought their defense, though, is playing pretty well. I don't know that their defense is any worse than LSU's. They had as good a game against Texas as LSU's had, maybe an arguably better one in a lot of respects. That's why I have Oklahoma 3 and LSU 4. We've already talked about how great LSU's offense is. Make a point. They are great. Number 4 is not a slight at all. It will not shock me if they beat Alabama, but right now I've got a little more confidence in Alabama offensively than I do LSU just due to track record. Alabama has much more of a pass rush than LSU, which is why I think, right now you're going to have a pass rush to beat these top teams because the offenses are too good to be on your heels the whole game.
All right, so you gave me 3, I'll give you 3. My 4th is Oklahoma. I think they're a playoff team unless they maybe even if they lose to Texas in the Big 12 championship. That's a weird scenario, but somebody's got to be in the playoffs. And a 12-1 Oklahoma might be there. They dominated the game more than the number will show. And really kind of like LSU, Florida, to use your example. They dominated the game more than the number will show, but the pressure forcing Jalen to make mistakes is something that we saw a lot against better defenses. Texas, with their depleted, injury-laden, and all the guys they lost last year, this really isn't a good Texas defense. And they were good enough to make Jalen make some really bad mistakes that we saw him make at Alabama. So that gives me a little bit of concern. I do think their offense against elite teams is not as good as it was the last couple of years, but I think that defense is significantly improved. And we said they only had to improve a little bit to be really considered a threat in the playoffs. So I've got them at number 4. Clemson at number 5. We've been waiting for this all year. And look, Florida State sucks. Florida State is not a good football team. They're not at all. But they are good enough that the number that Clemson put up Saturday said, we mean business. We're sick of y'all talking about how we're not blowing people out or whatever. They came out and they handled their business. But I will say, buried in that was another day where Trevor Lawrence went 6.8 yards per attempt, had an interception, really didn't look, Tua, we said this when we were watching the game for Alabama. Tua was 9 yards an attempt and had a ton of yards, and we said he was really off. So what does that say about Trevor Lawrence? I still think they can turn it on late. I still think they're in the playoffs because of their schedule, and I still wouldn't count them out come playoff time. One more to get through my 6th. That's Wisconsin, and this is the team, honestly, that has potentially is the most labeled, either up or down. I could see them being as high as 2 or 3. I could see them falling out of the top 10. I don't know what to think about Wisconsin right now. I don't love their quarterback situation. I love their defense. I love their running back. So Oklahoma, Clemson, Wisconsin are my 4, 5, and 6. So give me your, 5 and 6.
So for my 5 and 6, I've got the same 2 teams, Clemson and Wisconsin. To echo a lot of your points, that Florida State game, it's easy to say it's 45-14, but Clemson in that game ran 91 plays. Okay, and they ran it at 6.1 yard per play. Now there's some garbage time thrown in there. But to give you an idea, Florida State, their defense has been giving up a lot of points all season. They've been giving up between 5 and 6 yards per play, and that was against teams like Louisiana Monroe and Virginia, Louisville, Boise State, who it turns out is not necessarily so great. 6.1 yards per play wasn't shocking. The 45 points was a great game, but that also comes from the fact that Florida State threw 3 interceptions and did everything in their power to give it away. So I'm with you. I'm very encouraged by what I saw. I was encouraged by the fact that they ran for 6 yards per carry. ETN was dominant, but Lawrence didn't really show me quite enough. As much as he had 3 touchdowns and 1 interception, they're not consistent enough. They're not moving the chains well enough. It's hard for me to drop them high, to bump them up higher. I need to see a lot more games like this, and I need to see a lot more statistical production, again, especially against a team that you're within a yard per carry or a yard per play of what they've been allowing, or even a half yard per play of what Florida State's been allowing all season. It's just that their offense gave you the ball enough to get a huge blowout lead very quickly. Wisconsin, totally agree. Really good team, excellent defense. Really, really freaking good defense. It's going to keep them in every game, and a defense that maybe only Ohio State in terms of top teams. And I'll say Clemson, their defense has been stout. But I think in terms of run D, Wisconsin's probably better than Clemson. And maybe Ohio State, and I guess you could argue Penn State, that their defenses are on a different level. The Big Ten stepping forward in that regard, and the SEC does not have the all-around defenses. But yeah, I'm totally on the same page with the passing game in particular. 8.6 yards per attempt is really good. They've been solid in most games, but that Northwestern clunker sticks out on my mind, and I've seen enough from Cone to think that when they're not running the ball all over the opponent, I'm not sure that it's going to translate. That's why I've got them sitting there at 6.
Yeah, I think Cone was something. At some point in that game, he was under 5 yards an attempt. I think it was like in the third quarter. At some point in that game, he was under 5 yards an attempt, and I got killed by the Ohio State fans when I pointed that out. Kyle, you did, I remember. By the Ohio State fans, because in some way they took that as a slight to Ohio State, even though I have Ohio State number 1. College football's weird. Next, I have Florida, really not moving anywhere in my top 25, top 10, mostly because, yes, I liked what I saw against LSU, and they showed me some things offensively that I liked, but also that the teams behind them are such a question mark. This is what's frustrating, and this is we talk about it every week, and it's not changing. After 6 is my huge drop-off point. After 6 is my huge question mark. And this is not to say, so people confuse this with, yes, an Oregon or a Georgia or a Florida could definitely challenge a top 5 team in a one-game scenario. That the 25th best team could challenge a top 5 team in a one-game, one-off scenario. That doesn't mean over the course of the season I think they're really good, that I think they're the number 2 team in the country. There's a difference. Having to play a full schedule, there's a difference. Okay, so I've got Florida. We did a Florida LSU review where we talk a little bit more about Florida. I don't want to talk too much about that here. Oregon is my next team. And yes, Oregon has a loss to Auburn, who I don't have in my top 10. Auburn collectively in their other games has looked not as good as the one bad game for Oregon. I know Oregon had an ugly game against Cal. Cal's got a sneaky good or obviously good defense. Colorado is not a terrible team, and Oregon just hammered them. I think Oregon's going to beat Washington by a pretty good clip and show everybody that they are the best team in the Pac-12. I have them right there after Oregon or after Florida. Give me your next two.
So my next two are Texas and Georgia. So first off, Oregon doesn't make my top 10. And that's tough.
Okay. You can be wrong. It's all right. You're totally within your rights to have the wrong opinion.
Oregon has not allowed 10 points in a game since the Auburn game. And it really comes down to how much faith you have in the Pac-12. Now, they played Nevada, who's not good. They played in, I have to remember, the Montana Grizzlies. Not a good team. Montana's been good in the past, not right now. Stanford is not a good team this year. Cal, good defense, not a good team. Colorado, theoretically a good team, but has been up and down. I just don't take enough from Oregon in those games to really convince me. Beating Washington will be a lot, but it's tough with the Pac-12 being what they are for them to jump high, having beaten Auburn. They'd probably crack the top 10 if they win out. I'm sorry, it seems unfair. That's where the Pac-12 is this year. I'm going to move on from that point. Texas and Georgia. So Texas, I don't like dropping them just because they lost to Oklahoma, just because they lost to LSU. They were competitive in those games. And like you said, there is a drop-off after the top 6. I'm not sure that anybody in the rest of this list is going to be behind them. The big one for me is Georgia, and I'll go ahead and throw in, I have Florida right behind Georgia. So those are my 7, 8, and 9. Georgia and Florida. Georgia with their loss, Florida with their loss to LSU. Georgia loses to a South Carolina team. You have to punish them losing to a bad team. Florida loses to an LSU in a competitive game. I didn't see anything that makes me think Florida was any more competitive really than Texas was. In fact, I think Texas was more competitive, and I think Texas maintained that competitive edge against Oklahoma despite injuries. That's why I have Texas higher. But with Georgia, it really comes down to the fact that I think this was an odd game for Georgia. I'm not really trying to excuse it. I am punishing them by putting them down here at 8. I am not apt to move Georgia higher. Florida could jump Georgia. Georgia is going to have a hard time jumping Texas. Florida, if they beat Georgia, could move up into my top 6. Georgia is going to struggle to move into their top 6. But I'm kind of placing the teams where I think they're going to end up at the end of the season more than where they are now. I think Georgia with their run game is going to get Florida fits at the moment based off how Florida did against LSU. I think if Georgia probably beats Florida, so I don't want to put Florida ahead of Georgia. That's the reason they are where they are. And importantly, why you say, well, Georgia lost to South Carolina, why are they ahead of all these other teams? And that simply comes down to the fact that I think if Georgia played most other teams, they would most likely beat them. And I think Georgia is going to end up with a really good record at the end of the year that other teams would not be able to do against their schedule. And that's good enough in my book to be 7th, and right now not in my playoff picture.
It is not good enough to keep people from calling us SEC homers. And they're going to say, what about you not forgiving Ohio State for Purdue, not forgiving Ohio State for Iowa in those other years? Make no mistake, we still had them in our theoretical top 10. We just didn't have them in the playoffs. Right now, and we just did a review of the South Carolina, by the way, plugging our own content, we did a fairly in-depth, pretty quick review. Can you do in-depth and pretty quick? Review of South Carolina-Georgia game, and neither one of us said right now we don't think Georgia's a playoff team either. You can punish somebody for having a bad game, which this was a horrible game. Third-string quarterback South Carolina. You can punish somebody for having a bad game and still think they're a top 10 team, but not necessarily an elite team, or not necessarily like punish them enough to keep them out of the playoffs. And right now, agreed. I'll give you my last two, and then you can give me your last one. I've got Penn State next, and this is where if you have Penn State in your top 10, and you just said all that stuff about Oregon in the Pac-12, look, we're going to do a preview of Penn State, Michigan here in a minute, but if I am putting money on a neutral field game, Penn State versus Oregon, I think Oregon wins that game. I really do. I don't think Penn State's got the offense to beat a good defensive team in Oregon who has a quarterback. Maybe I'm wrong. And my last team, number 10, is Georgia. They probably end up a little higher. It's really going to come down to, I think they lose another game along the way, but 10-2 Georgia is still probably a top 10 team because these other teams are going to lose another game along the way. Penn State might lose this weekend. But right now, I'm dropping them to 10 because, look, I like the Notre Dame game. That's starting to look a little worse than we originally saw, but you can't lose to South Carolina. Can't lose to them. Can't lose to them, especially not in that setting at home with a third-string quarterback on the other side of the field. Can't lose to them. Give me your last one, and we'll wrap it up.
So my last one is Penn State.
Of course it is.
And then, of course it is. Yeah, it's tough. And there's 3 teams here that vie for that 10th spot in my view. And no, Auburn's not one of them. It's Notre Dame, Penn State, and Oregon. It's odd because Auburn beat Oregon, but we talked about in the preview, kind of funnily got beat up for it because they said they were all healthy and then they weren't. Oregon was out of receivers against Auburn, and it kind of hamstrung them in a game where Oregon probably could have, would have, should have won that game. I think Auburn's going to lose some games down the stretch. So that's why I've got them. I've got them out, but I still have them ahead of Auburn. And of the 3, I do give some merit to the fact that some teams win and some teams haven't. Penn State is undefeated, and the other ones aren't. Now, we talk a lot, would Penn State be undefeated with everybody else's schedule? I'm not so sure about that, but I think they would at least have a solid chance of having the same record. They could lose a game the way Notre Dame did, and they could lose a game the way Oregon did to Auburn. And so that's why I have them in the last spot. I think their defense is underrated. They've been playing good teams. The defense has been good. The offense, not consistent at all. Oregon, again, I already said my piece with them. And I'll say the last team that's vying that's not on my list, and you didn't have them either, so maybe this is something to end on. I think 8 in the AP poll is way too high for Notre Dame right now. One, I don't understand why Notre Dame, frankly, is ranked ahead of Georgia. I get that Georgia lost to South Carolina. I get that South Carolina is unranked. Georgia beat Notre Dame. We saw it. It was a close-ish game on the scoreboard. It wasn't really all that close. In fact, Georgia is a better team than Notre Dame. Moreover, Notre Dame has been flirting with not being a good team all year. They struggled early against Louisville. They struggled badly against a not good USC team. They struggled to put away UVA. Notre Dame, I'm getting skittish having them in the top 10. I've bounced them out. I can't really justify them in my mind having them ahead of Georgia. Honestly, I can't justify them having ahead of Oregon. I don't think I can justify having them ahead of Auburn. They're getting some benefit of the doubt given their schedule, and Notre Dame has a solid chance given the fact that their only remaining good game is Michigan. And I don't think Duke is probably a sneaky hard one, but the rest of the schedule, this could be an 11-1 team that would be a 9-3 team in other conferences. I'm just being honest. I was high on Notre Dame in the preseason. They have not panned out. And that's, I guess, my final point.
Yeah, and I've obviously moved them out of my top 10 too. I don't love what I saw against USC. And people are going to say, you're being wishy-washy or whatever. Look, we have more data. Our top 10s, if we've been the most consistent thing we've been with our top 10s is that they're infinitely fluid because we react heavily to data. I care more about data than I care about what my top 10 looked like last week, making it look very similar if everybody won. I don't care. Like if it's completely reversed the next week because we have more data, that's what I care about. And right now I'm with you. It's weird that they're just a couple weeks removed from losing to Georgia and they're ranked ahead of Georgia. That shows you that AP voters care far more about win-loss records than they care about who you beat, who you lost to, or how you played in those games. That's just the long and short of it. I will say I think that we've got enough cross data points with Notre Dame for them the rest of the way, for them to earn their way back in, especially the Duke one. I agree with you. I think Duke is probably the second best team in the ACC. Somebody was arguing with me in the comments of one of our videos during the Wake-Louisville game. It had just started, and I said Duke is the second best team in the ACC, and he said, no, it's Wake. And then a couple of minutes later, it's 28-7 Louisville over Wake, and he acquiesced. So I love that. All right, y'all. That's our top 10 for this week. Remember, let us know. Your homework in the comments is to give us your top 10 and tell us why we are crazy. Do it with data. Be nice, and maybe we'll engage with you. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.